Hi there, I'm Jerry Almonte.
And I'm Bobby White.
And welcome to A Word on Swing. Just here to chat and talk about a whole bunch of things that come to our minds, which could be quite frightening. You never know.
Yeah, or a little ADD. Or like I was a little ADD growing up. I don't really picture you being ADD.
What? How are you doing, Bobby?
I'm doing good.
This we're doing something a little change of pace from what we've been doing. Just want to try to do something a little simple, theoretically. One of the things that I've been thinking about is, or I guess we've been both thinking about this, is the idea of perspective in our scene, because we've been around for a while. What year did you start dancing?
1998.
1998. See,
and I realized recently that it's been 14 years, which blows my mind.
When I did that interview with Nina, she told me, like, hey, we've known each other 14 years old. I've known you since you've been 14. I have known you for now half your life, which is not half of my life. But one of the things that Nina pointed out to me is that if you compiled all the footage of the vintage stuff together at that time, there's a lot more of it now, but at that time, you know, you could have amassed several hours of footage, but you're only looking at maybe like 5-10 minutes of dancing, if you're lucky. And I think a lot of that contributed to how everyone developed their own individual style, because they only had bits and pieces here and there, and then they had to do a lot to just fill in the gaps. So even now that, you know, 14 years later, Nina and Naomi literally grew up and learned to dance side by side together, but you don't really associate the two with each other style wise.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about how in 2001 regional styles were pretty obvious. Or I mean, there were obvious differences if you were dancing in San Francisco versus if you were dancing in LA versus if you're dancing in Atlanta, Georgia versus if you're dancing in DC versus if you're dancing there were very big differences, and I think there's a lot less differences now.
Yeah. And it's because I think it's because we're referencing the same material. We're all looking at the same ILHC clips or ULHS clips or whatever the big fancy performance was in Europe a couple of months ago. And sometimes it's even by the same dancers. You know, they take the same routine around, or at least they dance the same way from city to city. Everyone learns from them, and they reference back to the YouTube clip. When we go back into this idea of perspective, we were just watching video from the first Champions level Jack and Jill that happened in North Atlantic Dance Championships in 2001. It was about spring of that year. Before that, competitions only existed since 1990. Or no, let me back up. The major competitions at the time had only started around 1998. There was always some sort of Lindy division at some West Coast event somewhere. But the American Lindy Hop Championships started in '98, so did Camp Hollywood. And then the following year, NADC, which was kind of this hybrid crossover West Coast shag, hand dance, Lindy Hop event, started in 1999. But you know, it took a few years before we actually amassed champions, because there weren't that many competitions to be champions of. Yeah. So 2001 was the first Champions level Jack and Jill for Lindy Hop. In '98 was also the big explosion in the scene. Not only were the two big events, ALHC and Camp Hollywood, that was also the first year of the first exchange, the San Francisco exchange. That was also the year of the Gap ad. Like, everything blew up in 1998. So most people started around like 97, 98, 99 from that generation. And so we get to 2001, and people have only been dancing about 2, 3, maybe 4 years if they're lucky, and now they're considered the champions of the Invitational Jack and Jill. Whereas now, you know, people have been dancing 3 years, and if you get lucky to be noticed in open, maybe advanced level Jack and Jill at a big event like ILC or ULHS or Camp Hollywood or whatever, you'd be really, really good, but also probably very lucky for that to happen. But it's strange to see all those people who were pushed up to that level back in 2001 are still, I guess the right word is influential now than they were than someone who can hope to be dancing 3 years now.
What's interesting, I guess, is that there's back then in 2001, 3 years was still longer. Like you said, 3 years was as long as anyone in that group had been dancing.
That was all the time.
Yeah, those were the veterans.
Yeah.
Those were the original dancers from that, like you said, from the big '98 boom.
Yeah, and the people who've been dancing longer than that, there was like Stephen Mitchell, Sylvia Sykes, people of that generation. They've been around for a while. And Sylvia still competed a little bit. I don't think Stephen ever competed. I don't think Stephen has ever competed. I could be. He might have entered like one of the earlier, like West Coast contests, but to my knowledge, I don't believe he's never competed in the modern era. If you want to consider like '98 on as the modern era.
Yeah.
There was Ryan. He competed a bunch, a bunch of places. But by the time '98 rolled around, those guys were like the old folks.
Yeah.
Like grizzled veterans. Like they didn't really need to prove much of anything.
So we were recently just watching a few of these clips, and it was amazing for me because I hadn't seen a lot of them originally, but it's been years since I've seen that style of dancing.
Yeah.
Instead, obviously to go through an entire contest and look at all of that dancing, it's probably been since 2001-ish time period for me.
Yeah. Yeah, and I just got a hold of this footage recently myself, and I haven't looked at it in a while. And it is a bit of a trip, but it's also hard to figure out. Obviously, a lot of the dancing at the time is a product of the music, because you can tell some of those kids were from SoCal, and Faulty and Amy and a bunch of people from Minnesota, various places. The kids in DC, like they knew how to dance fast to like more classic. Big band sort of stuff, but they were all kind of in first gear because that was the prevalent music at the time. The DJs were Jesse Miner out of San Francisco and Raynard Wilds, who is out of here in DC, and they pretty much DJ'd most of the big events at the time, exchanges, competitions, you name it, and they preferred a much slower, modern, more groovier sound to their music, and that pretty much. And everyone kind of adjusted. Like even a guy like Justin Zillman at the time, who was he was hardcore vintage at the time, when not a lot of people were. Although I guess it was typical for LA. But he adjusted. You saw his dancing. It was just, what is that?
Yeah. What's interesting to me is, I guess, 2001, the year specifically, doesn't mark like a really nice, I guess, tie-off point in the style of the dance at the time. So for instance, if the first Champions contest was 1999 or 2000, you might see a little bit more tidy as in like a lot of people really working with obviously the Eric and Sylvia style, mm-hmm. or the more like the classic Savoy style,
yeah.
or you would have seen a lot, I think a lot more cohesive kind of style of dancing.
Yeah.
But this is by the time that groove influence, I guess, was really influencing a lot of dancing. And so you'll see in this clip, like a combination of like people who had spent years and a lot of dedication trying to get down, like maybe the Dean Collins and Jewel McGowan style, or this or that style, now starting to incorporate the newer, like experimental things that they were playing with. And so you see a really interesting mix.
Yeah, because I tend to think of the modern era is divided up into like 3 or 4 year increments, because you have like Can't Top the Lindy Hop was like 94. Can't Top the Lindy Hop was like one of the first really truly big Lindy Hop events of the modern era.
Frankie Manning's 80th birthday party.
Yep.
In New York.
Yeah.
And
everyone was there.
It was the first videotape when I wanted to. I knew I had done a lot of 6-count swing, and I knew that I wanted to learn Lindy Hop, and I had no idea how to, because no one in Atlanta at the time really did it, or if they did it, they didn't know well enough to like show me a lot of it or teach me or that kind of stuff. And so one of the first things I heard about was Cantoff Lindy Hop, and that was one of the first. It was you know, $30 or $40, and you got the double tape. You had a tape that had nothing but performances of like the greatest Lindy Hoppers alive, and it had, which they were at the time.
Yeah.
I don't know why I put that in quote marks, but that's what it said on the case, and it served. It did its job. It lived up to it. And also it had a workshop tape where they had all of the workshop videos. So that's, I guess, those was the first workshop videos I ever saw.
I think they were the first workshop video. I think they were the first widely distributed workshop videos. I don't want to say they were the first ones. I think West Coast Swing pretty much pioneered that sort of I guess you want to call it marketing gimmick to spread the word about an event.
Marketing gimmick, educational tool.
Yeah.
Side.
I mean, they're pretty much. You could say the same about YouTube now.
Yeah.
But you know, that happened in '94. Then I mentioned that '98 was like the huge year where everything blew up and everyone came. A lot of the people that we know of as very influential came into the scene around that time. And then you get to 2002. 2002 is like the first ULHS, Mad Dog. That kind of like, I feel like 2002 is like one of those other hard sort of. You could point at those couple events towards the end of that year as the beginning of the old school revolution, where everyone decides, not everyone, but like that top level of dancers decide that they're gonna focus on looking back, like further back, and then which gets us to 2006, which I feel like U2, which I just mentioned, started in 2005. 2006 was the ULHS Liberation Final that like everyone and their mother has seen, and that signaled. I think that exploding signaled to pretty much everyone that there's this new. We are now officially in this new like technologically driven era, for better or for worse, in terms of marketing, in terms of learning, and then the last sort of. I want to say marker or highlight. This highlight isn't the word, but milestone is 2009, and that's when Frankie passes away, and that's the last Silver Shadows performance. ILHC had started in 2008, so around that time, 2008, 2009. But now it's 2012. It's 3 years since then. And we're looking, and well, lots happened since. I don't want to say nothing's happened, but if you want to look at the 3 years between '98 and 2001, where like Nina, Naomi, Sky, and all these guys decide to come up, or not this. Well, part of it's decide, but also they were kind of pushed to the fore. And then since now you're looking at the past 3 years, the different dynamic that is now at work. At the time, where you could still, it's easier in a sense. It's easier to pinpoint or try to figure out like who's coming up. But at the same time, even though no matter how good you can be after 3 years, you could also they have that person or persons still has a way to go to catch up to being an advanced dancer or an all-star dancer, all-star level dancer, champions level. So and we wanted to talk about the other things we want to talk about is like who's coming up, like who can we really identify as like the next generation, which is kind of a dicey deal because I feel like over the years people have been always pointing at and looking at some young dancer and say, oh, that's going to be the next Nina or that's going to be the next Sky, and that person just. All those people that have been pointed out to me over the years that they're gone, or they just totally bail out. They just didn't care, or maybe they're still around and they just kind of plateaued very early.
Yeah, it's a different scene that I mean, that's a lot, I guess a lot of the point is that there's kind of a different scene that we're growing up, that you would be growing up in now versus when we did, for that very reason.
Yeah, I feel like 2001 is like a total, like, around that time it's just a vacuum waiting to be filled by someone, and people are eager to identify. They're all looking like, they're looking for what does good Lindy Hop look like. Does it look like Sky? Well, that looks weird, but you know, it looks pretty good. Or is it Yvonne Hutt? Or is it, you know, Nina Gilkinson? Is it Celia Skylar? Or we're still like, we don't. People in the U.S. hadn't even seen Frida at that point. She was still in Sweden,
Waiting,
lurking in the background.
They felt rumbles, you know. They would see signs in the wind, occasionally a breeze, or.
I tell you, the first time I ever saw Frida in the States was the Harlem Jazz Dance Festival in 2003. That was another really huge event. I'm sitting at the Apollo Theater for the finals for this thing, which was huge. It was, you know, you felt like you had gone to Mecca. There's no Savoy Ballroom anymore. Like, the Apollo Theater is about as close as you can get to where these old timers like got their first bit of fame. And then all the finalists take the stage. They rub hands on the tree of hope, the stump of hope that's there. And then I hear these like two Asian women. Eventually I learned that one of them was Sing Lim and a couple other people, and they start chanting, "Frida, Frida, Frida." I'm like, who are you guys talking about? And of course that was Frida Segredal. It did kind of feel like an earthquake at the time, because everyone noticed Frida. Her coming to the States was not subtle. I think that's the hardest thing. Even at the top level, I feel like stage presence is not something that is a strength in general.
Totally, I totally agree.
There's a lot of like looking down at the ground. Even really good dancers.
I swear, like, I even came from fucking theater, and if you saw me in a play in college, you'd be like, man, Bobby has a lot of stage presence.
Yeah.
But I don't. That's so hard for me to convert into my dancing.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I was thinking about that because when you do that monologue, that Shakespeare monologue, I saw you do it. You've done it a couple times.
Oh yeah.
Like you do that, you perform that very well, and you project in a way that that's not necessarily the same as in your dancing.
I know. Tell me, and talk about one of the biggest frustrations over 14 years of learning dance.
Yeah, but I mean, a lot of people at that level are not. They don't project in that sort of way, which isn't necessarily a priority in something that's a social dance. But I guess it's something that you would expect would be better for people who perform.
Particularly, like, so I had a great conversation with Sky about the topic of performance and expression.
Yeah.
And I think, like, so in the dance, you have the basic level of lead and follow conversation.
Yeah.
And that's like a very basic level of, like, I'm asking for this amount of compression and the follower's responding in this way, or that kind of stuff. Then there's the lead and follow aspect of conversation, where I'm asking for five level compression, and the follower might be, I'm gonna give you 7 because I'm feeling I want to do something with that. And so now you're like conversing on that level. And then there's the visual conversation, you know, and on the simplest form, that's like, she did that, so that inspires me. In a way, stage presence is a very important part of that on a very subtle level. If you imagine, like, if they are feeling that, and I can see that, then I can respond with this that affects me in some way. And so the dance conversation on even presenting what you being visibly expressing what you wish to visibly, I think in very subtle ways can command the dance and the conversation in the dance. But you're right that it's very hard. Yeah,
it's very rare. I mean, I guess that's why we value it so much right now, or always. That's also how a lot of people get noticed. I mean, I think on a very basic level, most advanced dancers they can lead and follow. Maybe not to as good a degree as some others, but generally speaking, once you're considered advanced, you can understand the basics between like asking for a level 5 compression. And maybe I'm just gonna stand here and freestyle, and you're gonna respond off of that. So I think that's one of the reasons why looking at an all skate at an event, especially at like ILHC or something big like that, where everyone's good and they're all kind of good in the same sort of way, it's much harder for anyone to just peek out and say,
yeah,
I'm right here, I'm much better than at least 70% of the people here in this room.
Yeah.
And that is a bit of a challenge. Whereas I think in 2001, I feel like a person of Sylvia, Steven, those guys can look like a lot of shitty dancing and see like, that Sky guy looks kind of weird, but that guy's got something going on that nobody else in this room's got. The same with Nina or Naomi or any number of other people.
Yeah. So to the topic of an up and coming dancer today's scene.
Yeah.
Jerry and I often talk about this. First off, it's a great conversation piece to like talk about what's exciting you about this or that dancer that you're finally noticing. And we agreed that, and we're going to call her out on this live. Well, not live, but recorded. We're going to call her out by name. A DC local dancer that we get to see a lot when we're out dancing locally. So for us, an up-and-coming dancer is this dancer in DC named Caroline Sipe. So I remember dancing with Caroline over the last 3 or 4 years, and from the first time that I met her or so, and feeling that, here's your average run-of-the-mill intermediate dancer, but the amount of time over a few months that she got better, and even part of it is like the amount that you see them out, or the intensity with which you see them. Like, there's some people who just kind of show up and they might dance a little bit or that kind of thing, but she was dancing a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And there was an intensity, I think, in the way that she danced, even in those early stages, that maybe looking back in hindsight, I could have recognized as maybe a sign of an up-and-coming dancer is a certain, not necessarily how good they are at the time, but the intensity with which you think that might carry them in the future.
Like an Eye of the Tiger, sort of like a Rocky Balboa sort of deal. You kind of see it in some people who they're just kind of focused on they got their eyes on the prize.
Yeah.
Whatever the prize is, being having better connection or having better posture.
Totally.
Like that.
Totally. And so recently, pretty much every time I see her, over the last few months, she's gotten better and better. I mean, she continues to get better. Now she's teaching with us at the Jam Cellar.
Yeah.
And that in itself has made her, she's recognizing, or in teaching, she's learning a lot of things about how she dances and how to change the thing that she's dancing. So that's really exciting to see as well.
Yeah. But on the flip side of that is that, and this isn't a bad thing, but dancing with her, just connection-wise, she's about as good as anyone. I mean, as good as anyone was at, I think she started dancing about 4 or 5 years ago. Probably less than that. So connection-wise, she's got it down. There's not very much that she needs to improve on that level. But at the same time, there's the question. I mean, I'm not sure what her goals are, but what would she need to do to break out from being solid, being very good, to being exceptional? Which, as I mentioned before, the kids back in 2001, were just looking for anyone. Now most of those spots are full now, and it's hard to get punched through and say, and get noticed. I'm not sure and again, I don't know if that's Caroline's goal or not. But there does come a point for a lot of people where they kind of hit a wall or a ceiling or whatever, and the mark of how much you want to do this is how they respond to that. Because there are a lot of people who look like they were, like I said before, they look like they were gonna be something, and then they just decided at some point, maybe they recognize the fact that maybe I have to work this much harder to get this much better. But you know what? I've just finished my degree. Maybe I want to propose to this woman, and maybe I want to get married, and maybe have some kids. Or maybe I need to work 3 jobs just to pay the rent. I mean, everyone's got to make a choice. I mean, not everyone gets the option of being able to work on this full time.
Yeah.
Or a lot.
And even if you can't work on it full time, to go to the events and do the contests to get noticed on a national level, if that's your choice, is as you mentioned, expensive, time consuming. I mean, I remember trying to work a job while I was starting off as a professional swing dance instructor. I already was getting paid to do a lot of it, and even then it was still so expensive. It is so hard to work a job and go dancing and take off all those days of work.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even travel all that much. I've been to a few events. I've traveled to more events this year than I have in many years previous, and I've already used up almost all my vacation time. And I don't even teach or do anything important for a lot of events. Although I've taken a week off to help out with ILHC. But, taking a Friday afternoon and maybe a Monday morning to travel somewhere, I mean, that adds up. Even if you're just going, just to hang out.
Yeah. So talking about Caroline, we don't mean just to call her out on the middle of semi-national, international YouTubeage television.
I don't like that.
Mainly just as she's a great representation of that group of dancers who are doing really well. They've been dancing and have gotten to a level very similar perhaps to the 2001 dancers that we see in the contest in terms of mileage, I guess, in terms of years and putting a lot into it.
Yeah.
Whereas they're in a very different scene than the 2001 dancers were. And going back to perspective, what things do people recognize just as generic human beings? Like if you took a random person out of the mall and showed them swing dancing and showed them a swing dancing contest, like what things would they just naturally recognize as like things that are good, like in good taste in terms of an art form, versus what things take many years of experience as seeing the dancing so many times and approaching it from that angle. I think you've watched quite a lot of swing dancing over the years and thought a lot about it and that sort of stuff. So what would you notice versus that person who's right out of the mall, I guess is what we said.
Yeah, it's funny because usually what I do most days is I bring up what the latest YouTube videos are that are tagged with Lindy Hop, and even from the still, you can almost tell like whether it's like, oh, this has some promise, or this looks like it's going to be a disaster. And depending on my mood, I usually skip over it, but sometimes if I feel sadistic, I just decide why not. And a lot of times it bears out. It doesn't take long. It takes a few seconds to realize, something about their posture, just the way they walk is just uncomfortable. Like they look nervous, it looks scared, and it looks like it's going to be a terrible aerial that'll end up very badly for everyone. And I even noticed this on the street. Just watching people. I love people watching just in general. I just notice like the way they walk, how confidently or not confidently, or maybe they're injured. That's the thing that thing pops out. Even very subtle, like I don't know what the right word is to describe. Not necessarily injured, but I don't want to say disability either, but you know, usually there's like some sort of like physical affectation that usually jumps out at me about the way a person walks. Maybe not necessarily something that's wrong about them, but you know, maybe their shoes not fitting right, or something about like the way their suit is sitting on their body. A lot of those things, I think people notice, and people notice. You know, I mean, I mentioned this evolutionary biological imperative for us to be attracted or be repelled by things that are really strong or graceful or very fast. I mean, it happens in a bar. You know, certain people just stand out, just standing there, just chugging a beer, and you're thinking, you know, that's a dude I should just avoid, or I'm gonna say hello to that woman. Hey,
I think there's a lot to be said for that basic awareness of a confidence, or in terms of like swing dancing. Like if you took the same person on the day when they were extremely confident about what they were doing versus the day when they were maybe not confident about what they're doing, even if they did the exact same thing, I think a person would obviously spot the confident one as being more, expressing more.
Yeah.
And getting that and wanting to be engaged with that more, because I think humans naturally, the assuredness of someone who's about to do a dance step is much more engaging than someone who's not assured.
Yeah, I didn't really spell this out in my last blog post, but I did a blog post on YouTube statistics for various videos. But one of my theories about our scene and just people way view the dance in general is that people can, for the most part, on a very high level, macro level, people can figure out what's good. And you can tell that because you look at the statistics, and certain videos and certain dances, certain contests are hugely popular. Most of them, and because they're good in some sense, not just because they have a lot of flashy aerials or whatever, but you know, there's something that happens in that video. Way those maybe just one couple is dancing a one routine. Maybe it's just the energy from something like ULHS 2006, where like everything is just off the charts. People can figure that out. And you look at my favorite thing, maybe not favorite, but like another sadistic thing I like to do myself, to dive into the YouTube comments and see how many people who are first-time viewers of this and saying, like, how many of them are saying, "Wow, this is amazing," or "This looks like crap." On a random side note, there must be some other anti-Jerry out there who's watching all these videos and hitting dislike, because no matter how many views I've seen on a video, even if it's like 10 views, there's always one dislike on it. There must be some sadistic bastard just going to like all these Lindy Hop YouTube videos and hitting. I don't understand that at all. And some of them are so generic. It's just, but yeah, on a very macro level, I feel like people can figure out, even if they can't articulate it.
Oh yeah, and maybe sometimes the biggest difference between someone who's experienced that at watching it and someone who's not is just the ability to articulate more specifically what might be happening.
Yeah.
But I think that like things like flow and shape and rhythm and a connection to the music or a connection to a partnership, those are things that I think can stand out pretty easily to someone who's never. I think people could recognize a good version versus a bad version. I think one could, as you say, could probably point out the good one, even if they couldn't understand that it was specifically that they were more rhythmically with the music, or that they were flowing better, or that sort of thing.
I mean, I haven't been able to compile all the statistics to like any kind of like something coherent, but you know, just from eyeballing them, that's what it feels like. It feels like a lot of people can figure it out, and that's not a very scientific sort of analysis of the data, but it sort of gives me hope, because there is this other thing that's going around that a couple of people have talked to me about recently, is that you know they're always afraid that you know the cheese and the schlock wins over people more readily than you know very highly skilled artistically creative dancers do. And I'm sure you can find that on an individual basis, but the numbers seem to bear out that people can identify quality over, gimmicks and tricks and, step up 3D.
Yeah, we're talking about that because the Step Up movie is coming out, and I have a very big urge to see it. I know it's going to be horrific story-wise, but the dancing might be inspiring.
Yeah.
I told this to my I have a very good friend in hip hop and house dancing, and I asked her, I was like, hey, do you want to go see this movie? Because I think it'd be kind of fun to see it with someone of your caliber. She's very good at what she does, and she was like, no, we only see that to see our friends sell out. So I guess a lot of the group of dancers, and her friends, go to that. But she mentioned how a big problem for them in the house scene is that, if you look at a house audience, if you go to, I guess, a big competition, hip-hop house, pop and lock weekend kind of thing, and they have contests, and if 50 or 60% of the crowd is made up of people who are new to the scene, who their main exposure is like movies like Step Up, or So You Think You Can Dance, or that sort of thing. She says a big problem with them is that someone does a big flashy move that was once in a movie or something like that, and the whole crowd goes wild. And by Pavlovian conditioning, people keep on doing big flashy stuff to get that cheer.
Yeah.
Which is interesting when we talk about perspectives, because I think an audience as a whole is a different animal than an individual person.
Oh yeah.
And so, without realizing it, an entire audience will react to certain things that if they were just sitting down watching it one-on-one, first off, it might be a little bit more boring without all that crowd energy. So that's the positive aspect to a crowd. They might find, I don't know, they might be, to what extent, if you hear a noise every time something happens, do you start paying attention when that noise happens?
Yeah.
As opposed to just paying attention in general and sorting yourself out. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I find that even a challenge as someone who knows what he's looking for in a dance. That look at, as I said before, look at a big open all skate of a lot of comparable dancers, and just kind of looking for something, anything to grab your attention.
Yeah.
And the crowd helps identify that. And yeah, I mean, that means you might miss the really solid dancing in the corner. I've had this discussion with a couple people also very recently about how public we want our dances to be, or how public our events should be. Sure, we want the dance to grow. We want new people, but the flip side is if you want to appeal to all those people, you kind of do have to sell out. You kind of have to sacrifice, the solid, not very exciting social dancing, which is basically the heart of what we all do, and start throwing people up like 20 feet in the air in order to grab their attention, and so they're not watching Jersey Shore and say, hey, look at this.
Well, so first off, I guess there's a lot of different perspectives on what it means to Lindy Hop, and even Frankie Manning himself had a dual idea of what it was, because there was what he like the moves that he taught and the way he danced socially, which we only know of when he was in his 80s doing little class demos and just kind of horsing around and that kind of stuff. And then there was what he felt was the performance aspect of Lindy Hop, which he did for Elza Poppin', with the swing outs and the fantastic aerials and that sort of thing. And how I think to him Lindy Hop was both those things in some respect, I guess. I mean, I would imagine that's the way he felt, since he put so much work and effort into both of those things.
Yeah.
And to some extent, it's always strange to look at a contest. We mentioned several times, there was a couple years back at the ILHC Strictly Finals for Champions one of the things that blew me away about the contest was that you could theoretically put each dancer in probably first or second place.
Yeah.
Based solely on one criteria. Like, each couple kind of went out there and showed what performing in a Champions Lindy Hop contest meant to them.
Yeah.
And each of them was a different answer to that question, which I thought was really cool and fascinating. I mean, there were some people who went out there and it looked, I don't know if it could have been planned, that it looked as if they social danced it. And was really just concentrating on social dancing it. And then other people who went out there with a very prescribed jam set, but they still did a very good job with that prescribed jam set, and they still made sure that that prescribed jam set was musical as much as as much as they could make it.
Yeah. I think that's a very good argument for the fact that, or for the idea that we should not have standards in our contests. Now, when I say no, I don't want to say standards, but we don't have a set expectation of what we want to see as being the best. So it could be like the best 1 year, one spotlight. It could be the best aerial that comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Throws a woman, 50 feet in the air, scrapes the ceiling, Or it could just be a bunch of really solid swing outs, 10 times in a row. And we won't know that until we actually see it within the context of everything else. I think that's why we have competitions, is we want to put everything side by side and say, what do I like? So even though, they're the judges, they have their input, they have placements, but I like the idea of having having contests on YouTube, videos on YouTube, so it further democratizes the results. So even though you could say Max and Annie came in first, and then Nick and Lauren came in second, and Sky and Naomi came in third. Everyone else could look at this and maybe maybe a chunk of people and say, it's Stephen and Bethany, they didn't come in first. Maybe they didn't have do the same thing as those other guys, but I really like them in this contest. Or it could be Andrew and Karen or any other, just because I feel like I like what they brought at that time. Yeah. And then, maybe I have the power to go take a private lesson from them or hire them for a workshop or just send them a note and say, hey, I really like what you're doing.
Yeah. It reminds me, talking about perspective, one of the most important things I've done in my dancing, and I wish I'd done it a lot sooner, but, you grow naturally, so
Yeah.
But one of the most important things I did change my perspective was I went through a phase where I think like many dancers, especially in the modern era, started worrying a little too much about what contest meant and what it meant to do a contest and what that meant about your life or your future or that kind of stuff. And before you realize it, even either consciously or subconsciously, sometimes you start playing some kind of game where you're trying to solve the riddle of what that contest means.
Yeah.
And what placements mean and all that kind of stuff. And I think one of the biggest perspective changes I did, and one of the most important, is I stopped worrying about placements and started thinking a lot more about inspirations. And not what was that good, did I go out there and do well enough to place? No, just thinking did I go out there and was I inspired to dance really well? Or did I find that inspiration in myself?
Yeah.
Do I think that I inspired other people? And really making that change was difficult, but I think it was very important for me. And I see that a lot now when I watch. The same change happened to my watching habits.
Yeah.
Is like you said, I'd stopped caring who placed and started just looking at the videos and looking for what was inspirational for me.
At the end of the day, the placements, what use is that to you? If you weren't judging or you're not hiring someone for anything, if I'm just sitting in my living room, I can just say, I have the freedom to say, I like that.
Yeah.
Maybe the rest of your performance sucked. I kind of like that swing out right there.
Yeah.
That was, at 1 minute, 2 seconds, that was pretty sweet.
Yeah.
I can take that. It's mine. I think that's generally a good thing for our scene. I guess on the other hand, you could say it's a bad thing in the sense that everyone's looking at that same swing out, thinking the same damn thing, like taking that. But you know, if you don't have that at all, then what does everyone else? What do we have? We don't have anything to work off of.
You know, in thinking a lot about the original dancers and how isolation in a lot of ways led to creativity.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like these people here came up with this style of dancing. You know, Southern California came up with this style of swing dancing that no one else did because they didn't have something like Lindy Hop when the swing craze hit and was really, and the teenagers just really wanted to dance to it.
Mm-hmm.
And individual styles, like the things that you saw in this ballroom would have been different than in that ballroom or that sort of thing. Just based on the fact that they didn't have, they weren't pulling from the same well.
Yeah.
In fact, oftentimes they were in deserts, trying to just wander, bring together whatever water they could get. And like, I think I stopped trying to debate about which one is better, and realized that technically we are better off because we have the option of either one.
Yeah.
Like you can turn on the YouTube and be inspired by it, or you can turn it off and try to ipso facto build and be inspired by what you don't see. It's the kind of weird way of putting it, but
no, that makes perfect sense. It goes back to what we were talking about with what Nina was talking about in terms of just filling in there were so many more blanks to fill in early on, quote unquote, when we're trying to recreate the dance. And a lot of people came up with different sort of answers rather than saying, well, here's an actual 10-minute solid answer from ILC 2010 of what, 5 different kinds of dancing from the top level dancers at the time. It's not it doesn't give you, I think it's up to that person to make that choice, to take those options like you said.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people who are growing as a dancer to realize that they do have that choice. That you don't have to get all your answers from watching the YouTube clips all the time, or
even from like just even from workshops or anything. Like those are good signposts on the journey, but that's not the end of the journey. Just figuring out exactly how one specific person does a thing. Yeah. Like now you figured that out, but that's the first rung on the ladder.
It took me a while.
Yeah. To go, the rest of the journey goes to, everyone's journey is kind of different, or it should be different in order for everyone to look not the same. I feel like there should be some sort of like after school music.
Do, 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 do. The more you know.
Knowing is half the battle.
The other half is hunting it down and killing it.